I'm Paul Levinson, and welcome to Light On, Light Through, episode 356, a conversation with Chris Cosmain, author of Novikov Windows. That novel, if you've been reading any of my blogs, you would know, is something I had the pleasure of reading a few weeks ago. Frankly, it's the best novel I read not only this year, but the best time travel novel I've read in decades. And so I thought it would be a good idea to talk to Chris about the novel. You're going to hear a great conversation that we had, not only about the novel per se, but about Chris's theories of time travel and all sorts of other interesting things. Fascinating and profound. So here we go.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Well, everyone, as I just told you in my introduction to this podcast, we have a very special author that I'll be interviewing for the next roughly half an hour. His name is Chris Cosmain. Actually, that's his pen name, and we'll be talking about that too. But for those few of you who are devoted fans of this podcast, and you've also been reading my blog and various other things that I do online, you'll recall, I hope, that not too long ago, I published a rave review of a book called Novikov's Windows. Actually, it's Novikov Windows, right? No apostrophe S there. Good.
That's right.
Okay. And as I said in my review, this is easily one of the best time travel novels I've ever read. And certainly the best time travel novel I read this year, and in fact, probably in the past decade. So I couldn't wait to get Chris on here so we could talk about this. And why don't we begin by talking about the paradoxes that time travel inevitably engenders. And what I've been saying for 20 years, anyone who writes time travel who doesn't pay serious attention to these paradoxes, for me, that takes like 99% of the fun out of the story. So I know you do take the paradoxes seriously. Why don't you tell our listeners what you did in your novel to deal with those paradoxes?
Thanks, Paul. And before we start, I just wanted to thank you for having me on the podcast. And it's a great honor to be interviewed by you. To time travel paradoxes, when I researched this novel, and as a scientist by background, I sort of tried to really see what the actual scientific literature had written about time travel. And there's a lot out there, both on the actual, mechanics of time travel, what may and may not be possible, but also on the various philosophical stances to time travel. And I think what crystallized in my mind is there seem to be two rough pathways that one can go down with a time travel story. The first is one travels never to one's own universe. When traveling back in time, you travel to a parallel universe, and then the paradoxes don't apply. So, for example, if you have the grandfather paradox, where the person goes back in time, kills their grandfather before their parent was conceived, that paradox is simply eliminated because in the parallel universe, that history will alter its course, but it does not impact the universe that the time traveler comes from. The other scenario is more problematic, and that is where the time traveler travels back to their own universe. And the difficulty there is, of course, that all the paradoxes can arise. The stance I took is that we live in a deterministic universe. And what that means is that we can't change the past, present, or future. So everything is completely fixed. And there was a scientist called Igor Novikov who postulated this in a conjecture in the scientific literature. And he said, if there was to be a time travel event that where the person had a chance of changing something in the past, the probability of that travel event occurring would be zero. And that Novikov conjecture, Novikov Windows, is sort of, I've built upon that idea. So not only can we not go back and change anything, but if we were to be able to go back and we know the future, then we're stuck. It's like we're stuck in a play where we have to act out a sequence of events because nothing can be changed. And then in the novel, I explore the impact that can have on people's psychology.
Well, actually, I think that's a brilliant solution to the so-called grandfather paradox. And although I've been saying for years that I don't know why I don't know why the grandfather paradox in the first place has to be so lethal. You don't need to kill your poor granddad. All you have to do is do something to get in the way of his meeting your grandmother. And then, to be as modern as possible about this, you don't have to be so sexist about it either, right? Because if you interfere with your grandmother, whatever she's doing that day that she would have met your grandfather, that would work as well. But as you correctly say, the solution, and it's almost become like a standard textbook solution, is this idea that there are alternate realities. And every time you travel to the past, and every single thing that you do in the past, every split second, a new reality is brought into being. It's like there's an alternate reality created at the drop of the time traveler's hat, which, by the way, to me always seems somewhat absurd anyway, because even though time travel is asking a lot of anyone to believe it could really happen, I think what it's basically doing is it's conflating traveling across a space, which we always do in our daily lives. We go from here to there in spatial dimensions. It's conflating that with traveling through time. And I think the two things, space and time, are very different. So that was a pretty significant jump. But the idea that you create alternate realities when you do that, I actually think is probably more incredible, far more incredible than the notion of time travel. So good for you. Go ahead.
Sorry. I must say, traveling in one's own universe is more fun from an author's point of view, because how one might deal with the paradoxes in a way that doesn't sort of contravene physics is interesting. The other one that really caught my attention is what's called the ex nihilo paradox in the literature, which is when something comes out of nothing. And the famous example is the time traveler who travels back, visits their younger self, and gives them the plans to build a time machine, which that person then uses to build the time machine to travel back. So therefore, the idea and the plans for the time machine were never invented by anyone. They simply appeared out of nothing, which is what ex nihilo means. The interesting thing about that, and this is something I've dealt with on the technical side of Novikov Windows as well, is let's say you have a watch. The watch is given to you by your younger self, and then you wait until you've built your time machine, you travel back and you give the watch to your younger self. The difficulty with that scenario is that it introduces its own paradox, which I've called the aging object paradox, which is the watch will age in time, and it'll be subject to entropy just like anything else. So it might rust a bit or degrade. But then when it travels back in time, you now have the aged watch that has traveled back in time, which doesn't make sense, because that means that with each loop, the watch would continue to age. And yet it doesn't. There's a reset implicit in that sort of time travel plot line, isn't there? And what I actually did was, in sort of thinking about how a time machine might work, I came up with a unique solution to that paradox in Novikov Windows.
Yeah, you did. And we're not going to give it away in this podcast. As a matter of fact, the solution you came up with is ultimately the center philosophic component of the entire novel, and you delightfully rendered that in a totally unpredictable way. I mean, I will say about the thinking of those two scenarios, the first being the classic, where I speak Latin to my students from time to time, but when I'm having a conversation, I try to speak English. But no, it's fun speaking Latin too. But I refer to it's like even a 5-year-old child could understand it as the where did it come from paradox. And it's the same thing, something out of nothing. But as far as the watch is concerned, I don't quite see the paradox in that, because if this happens over and over again, first of all, there's no reason to assume that the watch wouldn't age. And so I think the way to do that, if this happens over and over again, is the watch gets older and older and older and eventually breaks down to the point where it doesn't work. I mean, an interesting variation of that, which I just thought of, is bring back a bottle of wine, a nice bottle of wine, which tastes good at the time, and keep doing that over and over. It might get better and better and better until finally it's vinegar.
So the problem with that in terms of physics is that we're dealing with what's called a CTC, or a closed time-like curve. So what you're describing is almost like a spiral where the watch has its own sort of internal timeline and it keeps going on a journey. But actually what's happening is, like say a serpent swallowing its own tail or something, you have something that's going around but returning to the beginning of a circle. And at that point, so it's not going around and around. There is only a single loop in terms of the physics. And that there's a discontinuity there where the aged watch becomes young again. And it's the question of how to solve that problem.
Yeah, that would be fun. Well, let me ask you, though, before I get on to travel to the future, as a scientist, which we can reveal to our audience that you are, okay, this is actually Albert Einstein's great-grandson, who is using the name Chris Cosmain. No, I'm only kidding. But as a scientist, do you think, obviously, there are some things like, well, for example, apropos of Einstein, I think that I don't see why faster than light travel will be permanently impossible. I know that, people have said strange things would happen, the nature of space would change. I get all that. But the problem indeed with time travel is there are so many different paradoxes that arise. So do you as a scientist think that there ever will be time machines invented?
I don't know if there will be. What I can say from my own reading, and I'm not a physicist or anything, by the way, but is certainly that time travel is scientifically possible, and that's a very interesting foundational idea to establish, because it means that if it is possible, then a whole raft of questions arises from that. Then, okay, so how do we do it? How do we deal with the paradoxes? What happens from there? Whereas if people simply said, look, it's not possible, physics just does not allow it, then I think everyone would lay the matter to rest and not ask further questions. So in a way, we're in a lucky position as science fiction authors.
And of course, Hawking didn't think it was possible because, for a variety of reasons, but probably his most famous is the chronology protection conjecture, as it was put, that the universe wouldn't allow time travel because it would have to act in its own self-protection. And by the way, I was so taken with that conjecture that one of my first published stories, I turned this into a murder mystery where the universe is killing scientists who figure out how to time travel, because that's how the universe is protecting itself. But look, the problems with time travel, if they're, by the way, you hear those like noises. My computer makes them from time to time when something else is happening. I could take them out of this interview, but I found over the years that it's more fun to keep them in. And it also wakes up a listener that might be slightly dozing off when they hear that. Anyway, the point I was making is if time travel is possible, in a way, this is the time travel version of the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox is about space travel and about intelligent beings that live out there in the universe. If there are such beings, how come they haven't made themselves known here on Earth? Now, some people might say they have. If you look at some of the crazy politicians in the United States, I don't mind, by the way, putting in a little bit of political commentary here, American commentary. Some of the politicians who support Donald Trump, I would have no problem believing that they're some kind of beings from, a completely different galaxy that somehow landed here. But the fact of the matter is, as of this instant, even though there's a constant focus on UFOs, there has not yet been an interstellar traveler who has plausibly showed up on CNN and convinced we human beings that this traveler came from outer space. But the same thing, I think, applies to time travel. If time travel is possible, unless we think the world is going to be destroyed, sooner rather than later by us, which unfortunately is a possibility, you would think that after 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years of our civilization continuing to develop and develop scientifically, that we would have some evidence of time travel. And have you heard of the John Titor, Titor stuff? Okay, so you might want to look it up. This began like 15, 20 years ago, like maybe I don't know, 2002, 2003, when someone by the name of John Titor, who claimed he came from 2025 or something like that, actually pretty close to our own time, came onto the early social media and began claiming that he was this time traveler. And of course, I don't think he was. There's still a cult following that still believes that. But why would you think then that if time travel is possible, we have no evidence of it at all?
So in the scenario I've postulated in the model, in the novel, because we live in a deterministic universe, our history is our history and it can't be changed. So what happens is that, yes, people are able to go back, but their actions and they are so well hidden that they've never come to attention, of sort of historians, if you like, even though in my novel, there are some famous characters in history who are impacted by the actions of time travelers. And again, without giving away any spoilers, this is one of the main plot lines in the book, is that people have to right certain wrongs that have occurred in the past and do it in such a way that nothing is ever known about it or comes to light as far as history is concerned. So that theme actually features very prominently in Novikov Windows.
Yes, I really enjoyed that part, and and actually, as you are saying, there are several parts of the novel, and not only that, what I also really enjoyed about the novel is that the historical figures who, in one way or another, may or may not be influenced by time travelers whose lives may or may not have been changed or saved or jeopardized by time travelers. They're not just confined to people in politics or even science. There's actually an artistic element in the book as well, and that makes that very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about travel to the future, even though I do think travel to the past is more wrought with paradoxes and therefore more fun. But travel to the future, at least as much as I can figure it out, is not so much paradoxical, but apropos of what you are saying, a deterministic universe, travel to the future violates our sense of free will. In other words, I'll tell our viewers, I'm in the New York area, you're in the Brisbane, Australia area, and if I were to get on a plane and travel down to Australia tomorrow, And but rather than just coming over to see you, when I got to Australia, I got into some kind of time machine, maybe one that you even wrote about, and somehow though I was able to change it so I could travel to the future. And I saw that you were wearing a red shirt tomorrow. That would violate your free will, wouldn't it? Because if I'm seeing you wear a red shirt tomorrow, for you, it's just today. You like to think when you wake up tomorrow, you might want to put on a blue shirt or a green shirt, not a red shirt. So that's the problem I have with travel to the future. You, as someone thinking about this, must have had a problem with traveling to the future too. Why don't you tell our listeners what you did about that problem?
So I actually didn't really have an issue with traveling to the future per se. And your red shirt, blue shirt scenario, which I think you've spoken about in some of your other podcasts as well, that would generate a Novikov window. Because if you came back to me and you said, Chris, tomorrow you will be wearing a red shirt, I could not change that. So I would be in a Novikov window where I knew exactly what was going to happen, in that I was going to wear a red shirt, and there just would not be a thing that I could do about it. And this is one of the philosophical issues with living in a deterministic universe, is that some would argue that we don't have free will. And that, of course, will really impact people psychologically. Imagine being told, sorry, you don't have a choice in this. You have no free will. You must act out history on a fixed timeline, and that's it. You can't change anything. So again, part of the novel deals with how this impacts people and how they deal with the problem. But the idea of not having forward time travel in the book actually came about from some of my scientific reading. And I did take a few artistic liberties here. But there's a scientist called Amos Ory who wrote a scientific paper in 2005, and possibly for one of the first times proposed a mechanism of time travel that didn't really involve exotic matter. So matter that we don't really know whether it could actually exist, and has things like negative energy densities and really exotic stuff, and that would probably prevent us from building a time machine, certainly in the foreseeable future. But the idea that he came up with is that he proposed this sort of donut-shaped hole enveloped in a sphere of normal matter, and then using gravitational fields, you could generate this sort of loop within that sphere. And if an object traveled around and around in the loop, it would go backwards in time. But in Ory's time machine, you could never travel forward from today. So you could only travel back in the past. Now, he also said that you can't travel back past the day when the time machine was invented, or the moment. And that's where I took artistic license. So I said, well, you can sort of push past and push one side, one mouth of a wormhole backwards in time. And that's how you would move matter. But I really like the concept that you couldn't travel forward beyond today, beyond the present moment. And so I just, again, somewhat in terms of artistic interpretation, I kept that as a sort of a physics rule for the time machine that these people were building. But again, to also not give away too much, but they did actually serendipitously discover another way that people could travel forward in time.
Yeah, well, not to give too much away, right? There's a major character who travels to the past and manages to get back to some extent to where he came from. But without giving too much away, he did it the hard way, for sure. But let me just throw in here, though, on this, one more point about free will versus deterministic. And I know that you have a keen understanding of psychology. In fact, you correctly bill yourself as a psychological science fiction author. And by the way, that's interesting to me just on that point, because I've often thought, if you think about, again, what Isaac Asimov wrote, for the most part, but for example, the Foundation trilogy and series, it really is social science fiction. I mean, psychohistory is social science, statistics and so on. And somehow all that gets glommed into science fiction. But the word science there does have all kinds of applications. But in terms of psychology, you've probably read and are aware of B.F. Skinner, and I think his mentor Watson. Their notion of psychology, known here in the US at least as behavioral psychology, is that every single thing we do in our lives is nothing other than a response to a stimulus or a variety of stimuli that we've already had. And although our minds sort of flatter ourselves into believing I'm making a choice, so I put on this shirt today. I think I felt like wearing this shirt, that again, free will. But no, Skinner would say, you don't realize this, that, and that happened in the last 24 hours to you. And for whatever those reasons are, let's say you had a very good experience when you were wearing a brown shirt, when you interviewed somebody else or whatever, that was a stimulus that got you to wear the shirt. And I think here, at least in the US, and I think in most parts of the world, behaviorism is pretty much like strict Freudian psychology, a little passe and 21st century, but a 20th century. But to me, I never believed that that's what was going on. On the other hand, it is just ultimately a question of belief. I mean, nobody can prove to someone else that they have free will. Because if I say to you, look, I asked you this question now because I felt like asking you this question, you could say, well, that's what you think, but in fact, there were X number of stimuli that got you to ask that question. So I guess the question I'm going to ask you just on this point, are you saying in a deterministic universe that the behavioral psychologists were correct?
Well, I think the way that I've dealt things, I've attributed the lack of free will to essentially the nature of the universe, and then one could postulate a pathway as to how that arises in the brain and the mind. And I think, as you say, a lot of early sort of work, like Skinner's work and things like that, they are foundation stones upon which a lot of theory and other recent advances are built. And there's some fascinating research going on now in terms of functional brain imaging, and people are actually trying to work out how we think. And there is some evidence that we make decisions before we actually are conscious of making those decisions. There's some scientific work that's been done, and that's one example. So there are all these there's this very compelling work that perhaps our free will is not quite as free as we like to think. But in the novel itself, in Novikov Windows, my treatment of free will was very much based on the nature of reality.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I do think, though, things that we do that we're not aware of making a conscious decision. So let's say our unconscious, to dip into Freud, is basically making that decision for us. I would say that that's not an argument against free will. It's an argument in favor of our unconscious mind having a mind of its own. And by the way, years ago, I came up with a really good example of that. When you're trying to remember somebody's name, and the older I get, the more I have that experience. And I'm saying, so I say to my wife, who is that guy, that we had dinner with, I don't know, 25 years ago? And I don't know, was it Jeff or Joel? I can't quite remember. And you can, in retrospect, realize your unconscious mind is working, because although you can't consciously at that point remember this person's name, your unconscious knows it. That's how you know it wasn't Jeff and it wasn't Joel. And it turns out, oh yeah, it's a guy from Spain. His name was Jorge, right? Right. And at that point, you're unconscious saying, "Hey, idiot, good, you finally remembered," and that's how you got the person's name. So I do think that the unconscious mind plays a major role. But let's move on to something else, which we actually have corresponded a little bit about. And I mentioned at the very beginning, Chris Cosmain, which I think, by the way, is a great name. It's a nice, catchy name. But it is a nom de plume, or plume, however you correctly pronounce it. And as we also discussed briefly, I am, and I've mentioned this in several of my other podcasts, I am a firm disbeliever in using pseudonyms. I mean, one of the main reasons for that is there was a girl by the name of Karen who I was sitting next to in junior high school, like in 7th grade, and she didn't pay any attention to me. She didn't laugh at any of my jokes. I really just couldn't make contact with her. So one of the reasons why I wouldn't ever use a nom de plume is I want her to eat her heart out when she walks into a bookstore and sees my name, Paul Levinson, on the shelf with a whole bunch of books, realize the terrible mistake she made back then. But other than that, there is, I think, an important marketing principle. The more times your name gets out there, the more likely it is that people will begin putting things together and realize you're a person that they may be more interested in finding out about. By the way, apropos of not remembering something, and this is something else my unconscious mind has, someone, not Andy Warhol, who said everyone has 15 minutes of fame, but someone, it could have even been a politician, said that if you appear in 9 media at the same time, and this was even before social media, you become instantly famous, that the magic number was 9. And I actually have appeared in 9 media at the same time, and it hasn't worked for me that much. So, but to get back to you, first, if you feel comfortable telling us why you're using a nom de plume, and second, do you think there'll come a time when you might merge your other life with this remarkable, even though you only have one novel published, remarkable life as an author?
Well, I think there's sort of 3 reasons for me having a nom de plume at the moment. The first one is sort of on a personal level. I'm a fairly private person, and I've never actually been on social media before. So this is an adventure that I'm feeling my way through on a personal level. So I'm happy to just take it slowly. 2, I'm still working, and I want to keep my professional life a little bit separate from my author life for now. And the third reason is simply pragmatic, and that is that I have a virtually unspellable surname. and I have been told that it would be akin to a grave marketing error should I use my true name, because no one will be able to look me up on the internet.
What I would say, if you have a bizarre, unpronounceable, almost impossible to spell surname, I would say that would be a plus. Because once someone got your name, it would be that much more memorable. It would be, there's no way anybody would confuse you with anybody else. So I'm going to adopt it as a project of mine to quietly encourage you. But I do understand, the part about your professional life. I often say, and we were talking about this before also, it's easy for me as a professor to use my name, because the truth is I write nonfiction as well as science fiction. And so my students are used to seeing my name in books anyway, and it only gets them more excited. Oh my God, you write science fiction too? And I said, well, yeah, what do you think? What you think is my nonfiction? I just made that stuff up also. And then they're totally happy about that. But, marketing is a complicated thing. So let me ask you this. Have you given any thought to, hey, maybe I should try to get my novels published by a major publisher? And by the way, my listeners know I've talked about this from time to time. There are advantages and disadvantages with every kind of publishing. With a major professional publisher, usually you'll get an advance. And with any luck, the advance would be thousands of dollars, and that's nice for sure. But so that's probably the main advantage. And because the publishers are in the business of wanting to make more money, albeit through books, so they're fundamentally good guys, but they're still in there to make money. They will work hard. The larger your advance, the harder they will promote it. But after a couple of months, unless your book has risen to the level of Stephen King, they won't refuse to talk to you anymore, or they won't refuse to consider your next book, but they'll stop promoting that first book. So that's a major problem. Whereas a much smaller publisher, they'll promote it for years. And obviously, as we know, you can publish it yourself on Kindle. You can create your own publishing company. So what's your thinking on that, both now and for the foreseeable future in your career as an author?
So the short answer is I would absolutely welcome, a publishing house taking an interest in my work, and I would be rather chuffed. I did try to reach out to some people when I started writing. I think, to be fair, I've honed my craft over, say, the last 18 months, perhaps a little bit longer, and I think my early work was probably, or the early forms of it needed some finessing. So it's a journey. I'm working hard at it, and I'm hoping that my writing will improve with time. When I did some research into the area, I think it's also, if you look at the numbers, I think it's challenging. I did read somewhere that, if you imagine, so for example, a lot of people will first seek a literary agent, and I'm told that literary agents might have, somewhere over a dozen people that they look after as clients, but may receive up to several thousand applications, every year. So, you look at the statistics on that, the likelihood of getting a literary agent, and then the literary agent needing to pitch the book, especially to major publishers, I think, that there's a lot of work and probably a little bit of luck involved. But having said that, I think going down the self-publication route, I think if there are publishers out there and they can see, okay, this is a person who is actually, people are taking an interest in their work, people like their work, they're getting reasonable reviews, and they're obviously making a huge effort to market themselves. I think that makes an author more attractive to a publisher.
Absolutely. I
So,
don't know
yeah,
if
so I would welcome if there's anyone out there who's taking an interest. I would certainly not say no.
Well, I'll say more about that in a minute, but let me just first mention there's an author by the name of Hugh Howey, Howey, Hugh, and he started writing, I don't know, about 10, 11, 12 years ago, a series first of stories and then novels, a post-apocalyptic series. And he began selling a lot of books through Amazon's Kindle program. And he did then get an agent who made a deal for him with Simon and Schuster, but he was doing so well with his Kindle that the deal that Simon and Schuster gave him was they would publish the hardcover and paperback, and he would continue with the Kindle rights. The reason why this is an incredible success story is not only did that happen, but just I guess 6-7 months ago on Apple TV Plus, a new series was put up there by Apple TV, Silo, based on Hugh Howey's novels. It did very well. I like to think in small part because of my rave reviews. They do have a good effect sometimes. And so Apple renewed the series for a second season, and it's a very, very good series. So that to me is a fabulous success story. And that might happen. I think it will happen with you. It certainly should happen. Again, as my listeners know, I started out before there was a Kindle, and I was lucky enough to get a top-notch agent and lucky enough to get signed to Tor Books, a big publisher. Before that, I had a lot of stories published in Analog. They're the hard, and they still are to some extent, science fiction magazine. But in the end, because of what I said before, they were great, promoting my work. But after I got a little more than a month because I had something, and my first novel won, the Locus Award for Best First Science Fiction Novel, which, by the way, you should look into it. I'll see if I can find information about it, send to you. Your novel, Novikov Windows, would be eligible because it's for first novels for this Locus Award given by Locus magazine. So we can talk about that anyway, through email or whatever. But I had a very good run, but it began to become clear to me that they weren't doing the job that I wanted them to do. And of course, I thought, hey, it got a review in the New York Times. Why don't you go for an ad in the New York Times? And I'll never forget, I had a meeting with Tom Doherty, and he laughs when I've told this story when he was in the audience. Basically, he takes me out to lunch, and he's saying, "Congratulations, it's great for us. It's great for you. The New York Times reviewed your book." And I said, "Well, okay, I'm glad you're so happy. I'm happy too. Why don't you go for a full page ad in the New York Times?" And he looks at me, he says, "All that would do is stroke your ego." So my first answer, good, I like my ego being stroked. But he then told me, and I think he was telling the truth, he had no reason to lie. He said, your review in the New York Times, that got about maybe 200 or 250 sales, which is good. We're very happy about that. If I took out a full page ad, first of all, the fact that it was already reviewed in the Times would cut into the number of people that would then buy the book because of the ad. But let's assume even there wasn't a review in the Times, or let's assume the review got people interested and then the ad got people more interested. He said at most it might sell another 300 books. And it's just not worth our money. In those days, it cost like $15,000, $20,000 for a full ad in the Times. So I asked him, I said, so then what is worth it? You tell me the book review doesn't do that much, the ad doesn't do that much. And I did learn a very important lesson there. He said, word of mouth accounts for over 95% of sales. So because of that, I eventually, left Tor, and for reasons I go into my other podcasts and other interviews from time to time, but I don't want to, talk too much about me in this interview. I left my agent as well. And starting around 2012, I began publishing. I got the rights back to all my books on Kindle. And within a year or two, I was making more money on Kindle than I'd been, with the publisher's copies. That's not true, by the way, for textbooks. I'll give this to traditional publishers. When it comes to textbooks, they have connections like with every single, school just about in the world. And so you can do very well with a publisher there. But for science fiction, they're not that good. So, but my situation is not typical because people already knew me as a traditionally published author when I started publishing more independently. And in fact, the first series of books that I had published were not me. It was a company called Josara Media in Texas, a very small press, and they did a very good job. So to sum all this up, everyone has to find their own path. And I think it's good that you're open to so many possibilities. Let's talk a little bit as we wrap this up. I know that you have some other science fiction projects that you are working on. And in fact, you wrote to me about one just the other night. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about that and about any other projects that you're working on? And then I can keep promoting this podcast as like God knows how long every time you come out with a new book.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm while my first book is out, obviously, I'm actually midway through writing my fifth novel. So there's a lag while I get the books edited, typeset, etc., etc. But the next one that's coming out, hopefully end of November, perhaps early December, is a science fiction action adventure, which is set both in the US and Brazil in the Amazon rainforest. And it's scientifically accurate, but a story about a mysterious satellites pick up a mysterious heat signature in the Amazon rainforest, and a group of scientists is trying to work out what it is. And at the same time, they discover a whole bunch of new species, particularly arthropods, so insects, spiders, etc. And the story progresses from there. But effectively, mankind comes under threat from a novel evolutionary process. And it's up to our group of scientists to see what they can do to help before time runs out.
Well, I love evolution, and I'm sure I'm going to love your second novel. And in fact, it has Amazon in the title, which is good because Amazon will probably think maybe the book is about them. And if you can work that into it a little bit, they'll be delighted to promote that as well. So one final thing, but I know the answer to this, but I'd still be interested. I'm always interested in what people that I interview, what their ultimate dreams are for their work. I assume you would love to see Novikov Windows picked up, and would you prefer it be made into a movie or a television series?
I think it would make a fantastic movie. And probably, a feature that would be relatively easy to film, given that most of it takes place in this single, remote and slightly haunted location in rural Australia. In fact, what would be wonderful is if an Australian filmmaker could pick it up, because I think while it appeals to a global audience, it is in many ways a uniquely Australian time travel tale, and it would be lovely if it was made into a movie that could be shot locally, probably in a location that would be fairly close to where the book is set, and I think it would make a wonderful movie.
Hey, it would be great if they could give you a part in the movie. I'm just trying to think what part. How about the guy that they start calling boss? No, not that. We'll get a better part for you. But listen, I do disagree with you about your choice of movie versus television series, because there is so much in your novel. I mean, when I was writing my review, I had to stop myself because I could have, written a small dissertation as a review. I mean, there are so many nooks and crannies in there, and so many different characters, that just think about a television series. I mean, frankly, it could be a television series and you wouldn't even cover more than the first third of the book. I mean, so it'd have to go on for several seasons. But hey, it would be great if they made a movie, of it also. But I think its place in audiovisual popular culture is in television series, because again, it's so rich. I'm glad that we brought this conversation though back to Australia, because one of the things I'd urge you to do, there is a whole science fiction authors and fan community in Australia, and if I'll see if I can send you some links. But over the years, there have been anthologies that have been produced just with Australian science fiction writers. So you should get known by them and get involved with them, because from what I've seen, they're really on top of their game. They write some great science fiction. And in fact, let me just conclude this by mentioning to you and giving a shout out to an American who's been living in Australia, I don't know, for 20, 30 years. He's married to an Australian woman. His name is Jack Dan, Dann. And I met him just, I guess, I don't know, about 25 years ago. But he also was someone who I began reading not quite as early as Isaac Asimov, but I'll never forget, I went into a science fiction bookshop in Greenwich Village in the United States. This might have been in the early 70s. I wasn't a kid anymore. I was already in my early 20s. And I saw this book on the shelf called Wandering Stars. And basically, it was an anthology just of science fiction on Jewish themes. And but that's the kind of mind he has. He writes about everything, about robots, about space travel, etc. So I will mention you to him now that I'm thinking about this. But should you ever run into him, mention my name, and he's like one of the sweetest guys in the world, in addition to being a great science fiction writer. So, any final thoughts or questions or comments, or as I say to my students, insults you want to hurl at me?
I just wanted to thank you again, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Yeah, and I look forward to some of the work that you're currently doing to have a read.
Well, yes, as you know, we've been talking offline about my short story, It's Real Life, which I've expanded into a short novel. And just to give you credit, I appreciate your advice that I should expand it into a longer novel. I mean, one of the problems that I have, I guess, in all aspects of my life, but especially as a writer, is when I accomplish something, when I've done something and it's in any way, it feels like it's, finished or set to go, I have almost no capacity to do more on it. I want to get it out there. One good thing about that is that allows me to do a lot of things. But on the other hand, I do think that things can sometimes use more work. Of course, that's what sequels are for. And let me conclude this by saying I hope, in addition to those 5 novels, at some point you come back to Novikov Windows and write a sequel to it, because if anything deserves a sequel, I can't think of anything that more deserves it than that novel. So listen, thanks, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
And I hope you enjoyed that interview with Chris Cosmain. Make sure you check out the show notes to this episode for links to my review of Novikov Windows, a link to where you can buy the book, all sorts of other goodies. And I will be back here soon with another episode of Light On, Light Through. In the meantime, stay safe, stay sound, and keep doing whatever you can to help the people living in democracies fight off the terrorists, the fascists, and the other evil forces that are attacking them in Israel and Ukraine.
The Light on Light Through podcast.
Athens, 2042 AD. She ripped the paper in half, then ripped the halves, then ripped what was left again into bits and pieces of history that could have been. Sierra Waters had read once that, years ago, it was thought that men made love for the thrill, while women made love for the sense of connection it gave them.
Curled Up with a Good Book says, Sierra Waters is sexy as hell. You can find out more about The Plot to Save Socrates by Paul Levinson at theplottoSaveSocrates.com.
Paul Levinson Silk Code about an ancient biotech war raging on in secret for centuries.